So, hello everyone. Today we have with us a well known American journalist, Derek Monroe. Derek has been a writer with the New York Observer, and he has been one of the very few journalists who has reported from the ground in Ukraine during the 2014 Euromaidan protests, where he had given an account of an hour by hour description of what exactly transpired on those few days. At the same time, he had done numerous interviews of people on the ground at the time who were on both sides, that is, those who supported the regime change and those who were protesting against it. Derek has also been on the ground in other war zones like Iraq. His work has appeared in the Institute of Policy Studies, and his work has been published in over 20 countries. A very warm welcome to you, Derek.
Good to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming here. Go to my first question. As somebody who has seen the politics in Washington closely, as well as somebody who has been in war zones and seen wars unfolding, I want to ask you, with regard to the current Ukraine war, what do you think is the role of the West, and especially the US? Do you think it is the US didn't do enough to stop the war where they could have done something with talks, or B, the US actually was instrumental in escalating it, or C, the US couldn't have done anything anyways, it was just between Russia and Ukraine, and they might have tried enough, which failed?
Well, I think the concise answer to this question would be A and B. We are basically right now in the middle of the proxy war between West and Russia, to the point where the mechanism of regime change and also what has transpired since 2004, original Orange Revolution, and then Euromaidan change in 2014, it's just a step in a process of getting Ukraine to be sort of a member of the West in order to undermine Russia's standing as a geopolitical global power. So this has been a pre-thought strategy that was originally dreamed up by Zbigniew Brzezinski, which was a national security advisor to the Carter administration back in 1978-79, who also orchestrated the idea of Afghanistan being a linchpin to go after Soviet Union, to make sure get Soviet Union mired in a very prolonged and very bloody and expensive conflict that later transpired into not only Mujahideen movement, but also to Al-Qaeda and all the stuff that we had problems with pretty much since 2001, attack on World Trade Towers. So this is really more of a global geopolitical strategy that's dreamed up by our government. And this is one of the elements of the global tilt, I would say, towards the more of a proactive stand on keeping our economic and political supremacy over the world. Most people in the global market media will not simply acknowledge this, because it's for a lot of different power centers that play an incredibly expensive as well important role in keeping a degree of narrative that reinforces our standing as a democracy. But the way our government often operates outside of the United States, even when it comes to regime change and also supporting certain regimes, it's basically the end justify all means. And what you have right now is simply a very tragic blowback of our policy, where Russia basically reacted to our foreign policy by military aggression against Ukraine, which was basically in the cards for a pretty much long time.
So if I may ask you here, I can understand there was certain things building up in terms of provocating Russia, but the reason that they immediately gave was that of NATO expansion, and it possibly being expanded to Ukraine, where Ukraine could become a part of NATO. But it was very well known that Ukraine couldn't have become a part of NATO anytime soon. So why was there a rush to start this war now? Was there any justification to use this as a reason? Was there any imminent threat for which Russia had to invade now?
That point is good, although it's coming under dispute, because under the United Nations Charter 51, every state has a right for self-defense when there's an imminent danger. So legally, attack on another country, if it's presents most imminent danger, is not by itself outlawed. And Russia has been invoking this on the international scale, especially the United Nations, stating that several days before the attack on Ukraine, there's been a pretty concentrated effort of the Ukrainian military forces in bombarding Donbass, Luhansk, and Donetsk, which by themselves are not part of Russia, but they're part of the Ukraine under the so-called rebel control. In the two republics, which are self-proclaimed, they're not recognized internationally, only by Russia. So there's definitely a great area here. However, the whole attack on the 24th of February against Ukraine has been really a surprise for everyone, all the analysts, because obviously any kind of degree of military operation or special operation, however you want to call it, frame it, it's very detrimental to any side that's actually involved in a protracted military conflict. It doesn't make Russia good, it doesn't make Ukraine good either. So in a way, it creates not only a degree of conflict that doesn't need to be, but also creates a variety of different, I would say, blowbacks that as of right now, NATO is quietly, but rather, I would say, firmly involved in arming Ukraine by bringing a lot of different weapon systems to the country itself. That's why I characterize this this situation as a proxy conflict between the West, mainly United States, and Russia itself. So, you know, after this conflict ends, we are definitely going to be privy to a lot of different documents, a lot of different versions of events, because as it is right now, both sides use a very, very strong propaganda to propagandize their point of view. So there's an incredible degree of fog of war, not only on the ground in Ukraine, but also in the political circles. So it's very kind of hard to tell exactly what precipitated the attack on Ukraine itself. And I'm pretty sure we are going to get down to the bottom of that later on when all the documents and all the data becomes available after the peace is signed, and a lot of historians maybe get involved in this process. But this would be the answer to your question.
Thanks. Coming to Donbass, the Donbass region, I understand there was a lot of aggression and a lot of bloodshed that had happened since 2014. However, in the past few years, the number of casualties, especially in the civilians, were coming down. So to have Donbass as the reason for starting this war now, do you think it was justified?
If the version of events produced by Russia is such that they've been under constant bombardment and attack, that I would say it would be a matter of self-defense. However, once again, the situation is where the Donbass was itself attacked by Ukrainian forces. There were roughly numbered about 60,000 units, mostly the Krak National Guard, as well as the Azov Battalion and a bunch of different military units. Then obviously there would have been a plausible excuse for self-defense. But please notice that also two attacks took place, one north of Kiev that was supposedly destined to encircle Kiev, as well as one from Crimea. So and there was no military as of February 24th. There was absolutely no military action.
That was in 2014. That was quite some time back. The Crimea annexation.
Yes, but the attacks also took place not only from Donbas area as a supposed self-defense by Russia, but also from north of Kiev and north of Crimea, and those areas didn't have any military activity. I'm talking about February 24th. There was an attack from three different sides, and yes, but what I think what's really important to stress here is that U.S. and international media always refers to the current situation in Ukraine as it started on February 24th. The real situation predates that. It starts pretty much around Euromaidan, when there was basically a regime change, and the variety of different protagonists came to the political sphere to basically reorient Ukraine against the will of its people, because I strongly want to emphasize this point. What happened in Euromaidan 2014, in around February 22nd, was a coup. It was not a electoral process that brought new government in with a new policy. The existing government, although it was corrupt, was overthrown, and the new pro-Western government was put in, basically ad hoc. And as the recordings of the Russians presented as a part of their propaganda machine, was that Victoria Nuland and other people from the U.S. State Department were heavily involved in selecting the government in Ukraine. So that in itself really made the whole movement completely illegal, not only in domestic in Ukrainian law, but also in international law as well. So we have many different dynamics that took place here that led us to the February 24th, 2022. And those things are obviously part of the whole picture if you really want to understand the really complex situation in Ukraine.
Okay, so if I may ask you here, I do understand 2014, it was a coup and it was a democratically elected leader who was ousted precisely because maybe he was Russia leaning. And we don't know how it transpired, whether it was really people on the ground in Ukraine who supported it or whether it was outside forces who were doing it. But later, the two presidents who came afterwards were both, they both came democratically elected, and they were actually with the support of the people of Ukraine. So do you think after that, 2014, if could have been left behind, because after that, we had democratically elected leaders who ran the country. So Ukraine could have moved on rather than keeping its the brewing war of 2014 going on. Was it possible?
Well, it's a matter of legitimacy. Frankly, it's kind of hard to tell exactly what really what is considered the legitimate government. For example, obviously, Ukrainian governments were internationally recognized. But for example, the Yatsenyuk government, which took place right after 2014, which was a caretaker government, then had the public elections with a heavy involvement of the Western electoral advisors, electoral consultants, who messaged a certain population into a certain way. They used basic socio-techniques to move the population to a certain degree of popular decision in the form of manufacturing consent into getting Ukraine into the so-called Western sphere. And this was how the Poroshenko, the so-called chocolate king, was elected. After that, you had a Zelensky, who was an actor, who were what people don't really now remember, they run specifically on a peace platform. He was supposed to be the guy who implemented the Minsk Accord, which was the intergovernmental agreement between Russia and Ukraine, with the sponsorship of a lot of EU countries, that were supposed to guarantee the peace process on the ground, which would also represent de-escalation of the conflict, which would, if it was truly implemented, we'd not be having the situation in Donbass right now. We'd not be having the war itself. And Zelensky made an electoral promise to the people who elected him that he will be a peace president. But unfortunately, there are a lot of forces which prevented him from implementing the Minsk Accords on the ground in Ukraine. Therefore, the situation escalated to the situation that we have right now. So only because there's an election, it doesn't necessarily mean that the government itself is legitimate. You have to also look at the number of people who participated in the voting itself. But I think once again, this goes to the point of 2014 election, where the continuity of the electoral democratic process has been disrupted by the coup. And what happened afterwards was simply a result of that. So as I said, I'm not an international law scholar when it comes to election law, so I really cannot confirm or have a stronger opinion. So about whether the governments after that were legally elected according to the Ukrainian law. My opinion, they're not, and I asked about this several different times. However, those governments were internationally recognized, so we have to take them for what they are.
If I may play the devil's advocate, and I do understand that there was a huge amount of agony when for people who were in favor of Russia in 2014, and that's how Donbass was created. But if if the situation on the ground was actually getting more peaceful in Donbass, which the numbers show actually in terms of the in terms of casualties, in terms of people who were getting injured, or people who are being uh, uh, people who were suffering, civilians especially. Was it not moving towards a peaceful direction where this war has actually escalated it for no reason, and it has actually created more sufferings for people in Donbass?
Yes, well, I've been to Donbass and I've been to both sides of the conflict in 2017. It was a strange war, and there was more of like a very strange coexistence of both sides, where you could literally cross from the front lines in some kind of checkpoint, just pay some money, go across. And I've heard stories on both sides where, yes, occasionally there was some kind of degree of the fire exchange, and occasionally maybe 1 or 2 people died per month. But the conflict was sort of like a very frozen conflict, to say the least. This whole thing escalated since Zelensky has been appointed, and one of the prerogatives of his rule was to get rid of a lot of neo-Nazi influence in Kiev, to the degree where neo-Nazis were a very small part of the Ukrainian population, the government, but a very strong and militant part, which they would literally put a lot of pressure on the elected parties and elected legislators within Verkhovna Rada, which is their parliament, to pass certain legislation or make the go a certain way. And actually, neo-Nazis had threatened Zelensky on several different occasions, where if he was to implement the Minsk Accords, which would bring peace to the country, they would basically hang him from the lamppost in front of the parliament building. So this was a very much a continuous line of threats, which was sent against his government. So Zelensky and Poroshenko before him, they found a solution to this problem to incorporate some of the neo-Nazi elements into the National Guard and set them out to the east to fight with the Russians. Sort of out of sight, out of mind up situation. And this is where a lot of the Western trainers, Navy trainers, got involved on the ground to build up the Ukrainian military to the point where they felt they could represent a certain degree of military muscle against Russia, DPR, LPR forces, which were militia forces of those two so-called independent republics, and reclaim the land. So this was a sort of a long-term strategy where legally Ukraine, although it signed the agreement, was legally obligated to reinforce the agreement to de-escalate the situation. However, I think the situation on the ground east, in the east and in Donbass area, when Zelensky was simply faced with a situation where the military units made up of a lot of different National Guard and the right-wing elements and neo-Nazis were simply beyond his control. They would just do whatever they think they would do, without any kind of degree of control from central government. And these are the elements which were the most heavily trained and heavily supported by the West. And this was sort of a undermining the official policy, which was supposedly implementation of the Minsk agreement, while on the ground at the same time, the idea was to simply arm and reinforce and train the most militarily solution-oriented parts of the Ukrainian military to do its own job independent of the government itself. So you can see is that as far as the Zelensky government is concerned, they had different priorities and different prerogatives, because they were originally, I believe, and it was to what I spoke with a lot of people in Kiev about this, their belief in peace, in implementation of Minsk agreement was rather sincere when he was first elected. However, he realized that later on the ground that he has a very little control of the military forces itself. And this is why kind of the situation kind of spun out of control to the point of having a military conflict, full-blown military conflict right now.
If I may ask you here, wasn't it in the interests of Ukraine to bring peace in the Donbass region and implement the Minsk Accord? And wasn't it also in the interests of the military battalion that you're talking about as of? Because as long as they had the Donbass problem brewing on their borders, they could have anyway never joined NATO. if they really wanted to join NATO, they had to solve that problem first. So it was more in their own interests, I would have thought, to bring peace in that region.
Well, looking from the outside, you have to, that would be the common sense situation, but you have to understand the Ukrainian political setup. Ukrainian politics is made up of parties which are clearly and straight funded by oligarch class. And the parties represented in the parliament are simply a extension of each individual oligarch's interests. And that includes includes Zelensky as well, who himself is a product of a Kolomoisky oligarch, who happened to be a Jewish billionaire that is based in Switzerland right now. So, you know, if you look at a particular political interest of how the country is set up, the population is clearly not represented. You have a situation where majority of the political interests are with the West, that's where the money is, that's where the business is. And that also includes a lot of interest, economic interests that come from the West, normally US, Western Europe, Israel, you name it. They have invested a huge amount of money in the Ukrainian economy, specifically post-coup in 2014, where the degree of economic dislocation was such that they were able to buy a lot of properties, pennies on a dollar. So this type of chaos also creates a lot of economic opportunities, a lot of different players that come in and simply scoop out the part of the economy for themselves with the collaboration of the Ukrainian oligarchs themselves. So, so thinking, for example, from the political setup where we have democracy and people supposed to elect their representatives to represent them, and then that would translate into the certain degree of a peace process that would be good for everyone. This would be a normal thinking within a democratic system. However, Ukraine has never been a democracy. It's not a democracy. It's basically a degree of, I would say, kleptocracy, which is reinforced by a variety of different party systems, which represent the interests of the political class connected with the oligarchs. And from their standpoint, the idea was to simply extend the conflict as much as possible to the degree where they would not only regain the conflict, the areas which they lost in the south, which is Crimea, in the east, which is two republics, but also instill some type of degree more of a united force of the West versus the Russia to play this narrative. So yes, from a geopolitical and process standpoint, what's been taking place right now in Ukraine is very counterproductive to the normal EU acquisition process, because no state which is in a state of war or doesn't have a or any state which doesn't have a clearly defined borders cannot be accessed to the European Union. But it said the political system in Ukraine doesn't prevent that, because it's basically it's based on ongoing antagonism against Russia. This is the reason of the existence for a lot of different political parties in Ukraine themselves. And as you know, people who are speaking out against these policies, there are several different small parties, were outlawed, basically, and including some of the people of the opposition being put in prison, even before the attack on February 24th started. So this is sort of a kind of prolonged process of military confrontation that's been years in the making, and Ukraine thought that being a victim, at the same time, they would get a special treatment from the European Union and the United States. And to a certain degree, they are, because they're getting a huge amount of weapons, and you know, and even even top management of the country, including Zelensky, it's rumored to have a $30 million house in Miami, for example, that it's kind of waiting for him in case things turn south. So, you know, we tend to, from the West, to make a variety of different deals with the local oligarchy or local ruling class. We have to make sure that, first and foremost, the people who are working for us or working with us are personally taking care of their families or what have you. And then whether this translates to the rest of the population is questionable. A lot of times it's not. I mean, what happened in Afghanistan, what happened in Iraq is a really good example of that as well. Because this is definitely parallel how the situation is developing in Afghanistan, as well how the situation is developing in Ukraine. Because it isn't our geopolitical interest by our ruling elites to have the very prolonged conflict in Ukraine, just the same what happened in Afghanistan to us a few years earlier, to make sure that the conflict is a ongoing concern to Russia, that Russia spends more resources, that it depletes its military power, and to the point where Russia basically becomes powerless, and militarily and economically. And then it would have been a really easy pickings. To that effect, recently there was our chief of U.S. military forces, ex-military forces, Mr. Breedlove, actually gave an interview to, I believe, NPR, National Public Radio here in the U.S., which he specifically stated that the goal of the United States government is to prolong the war as long as possible, because 4 or 5 years, Russia will fall apart. So it's basically scorched earth policy, which has absolutely no regard to the population, no regard to destruction, human suffering. It's basically to prolong the war as long as possible to make sure that Russia basically gets bloodied out of this whole thing. The same would happen in Afghanistan in Soviet Union for a period of 10 years,
If that
1979.
if that
Yes.
is really US's goal, do you think Russia actually walked into that trap? Because there was no compulsion for them to start this war. If they are going to be, it was US's plan to drain them militarily and economically through this war. Why did Russia decide to get into it?
Well, it's a $64,000 question, how we call it here in the US. It's, a lot of people already pontificate whether it was a trap, whether it was a preconceived notion by Russia to react angrily because of the constant pressure from the West. I'm not in Putin's head, and frankly, I don't know what Putin's plans, Russian plans are, and anybody who says they do, they're lying, because nobody really knows this. I just from my experience of dealing with the Russian geopolitical sphere, I can tell you they're incredibly brilliant and smart people. And frankly, I was surprised, like anyone else in the geopolitics that constantly writes about this, that attack will take place. So it's regardless of what was U.S. media was spooling at the time. So it's kind of really hard to tell what the modus operandi is. Economically, I would say Russia is actually doing really well, because ruble came back to the same level just yesterday that it was before the invasion, almost 74 to $1, which is almost the same. And actually, the oil prices worldwide market shut up like crazy. So actually, financially, they're doing much better than before. So the whole rationale of sanctions doesn't really work. And I think the Russian government pre-thought all the different repercussions which would take place in their action, and planned out quite well, I think. So I don't know what the next step would be. But it's, as I said before, it's a question that I think we have to wait more to how this conflict ends to answer, because nobody really knows what was the rationale behind Russia.
If you think it was planned out, don't you think that if Russia was really thinking of supporting people in Donbas region and fighting for the cause of whoever was being oppressed in Ukraine, they have actually lost all currency for any sympathy towards them by starting this aggression, because it was similar to what happened to the US when their lies of WMD and their aggression on Iraq created in terms of the sympathy for the rest of the world towards US. People did not take them seriously anymore. So don't you think Russia has actually created that? So they have not really, didn't they know that they are not going to earn any garner any support from the rest of the world in terms of helping the people of Donetsk, if that was what they were after? Instead, they have actually withered it away.
Well, unfortunately, I get your point, but I think what a lot of people don't realize, the foreign policy, including military action, it's always, at least in the United States and superpower view, it's always played out to the domestic populations. So, for example, our response in Iraq and Afghanistan has been heavily propagandized, and despite a variety of different problems, including some war crimes, our popular support for the war was initially very high. And also the same thing in Russia, because it creates a degree of echo chamber, national echo chamber, that makes Russians to be a good people who are going to defend their brethren in Donbass. And there was actually even Putin's stated policy that whatever the Russian people are, it's his duty and role to defend them. which was many different countries, let's say in Baltics, where they have a huge Russian population as a minority, was actually considered a threat to a certain degree. And you can take it any way you like it. But I think if you look at the Russian polls and also a variety of different Russian reporting on the ground, the support for the action in Ukraine, in Russia itself, is extremely high. But it kind of dissipates among the age groups, because you see a lot of young people who are not only more likely to be drafted into the military to fight the war, but also who are much more exposed to Western culture. They're internet literate, whatever. They have a much bigger reservations towards the action itself. And the higher up you go in age, the bigger the support that Putin gets. But you have to see the aspect of the foreign policy as an extension of the domestic politics. And I think it's also really crucial to understand the Russian political system itself. We look at from the West at Putin itself as sort of like a Tsar, where he's basically bringing the country back to the Peter the Great era, where one guy, the absolute monarch, decides everything. The reality on the ground in Russia is completely different. There are a lot of different power circles within Russia itself. Yes, Putin plays a very important role in maybe balancing those different power circles and influences to present coherent domestic international policy and execution of that. But this is not this is more like a Rubik cube, where you look from the outside and you see one side of the Rubik completely perfect, while on the other, in the back and the sides, you see a complete disarray. And the Russian political system operates this way as well. There are a lot of different competing interests within the Russian political sphere, including also military-industrial complex, just like here in the United States, where they have their own interests to galvanize and push, regardless of what the official policy is. So this can be taken also as some type of degree of reinforcement or consolidation of power by Putin in Russia itself, by using external threat to do that. And this is maybe he's definitely been using that, specific cracking down on freedom of the press, and jailing independent journalists, and whoever says something. You can even be jailed in Russia for calling the special operation a war, which in itself it is a war. But it's just semantics which are being used in order to kind of control the population, control the narrative. And it's similarly to the United States. So I think he also learns. The funny thing is, the way we tend to portray the Russian political system and how opaque and how quote unquote ruthless it is, we also tend to not misunderstand Putin's reaction to a lot of different things happening in the West, of adapting some of the socio techniques and the political machinations to his own political game as well. So I think a lot of times Putin is an extremely good student of history and student of the political processes that take place, which he actually kind of implements within his own sphere itself. So you see a degree of domestic politics really playing out international politics and the violence as well. And this would be the short answer to that.
I understand. Coming to Mariupol, I think one of the biggest reasons that it has become a target city for Russia's aggression is because there are many Russian-speaking people there, and perhaps Russia is trying to save them from the Ukrainian administration who were oppressed. I had this question that if Mariupol is so full of Russians, why didn't they migrate to the Donetsk region if they were oppressed by Ukraine?
Well, good question. I actually been to that part of the Ukraine, and when the war started, you have to understand one thing. You have to understand the structure of the Ukrainian economy to really understand the whole geopolitical setup itself. Ukraine itself is an extremely poor country. It's the poorest country in Europe, where the regular salary for somebody working, let's say regular jobs, like $200 to $250 a month, which even, and you're talking about prices, if you go to supermarkets, are not that much different than what you see in the United States, for example. So the degree of mobility of the population that is basically living at subsistence level or slightly above it is very limited, number one thing. And number two thing is, people are very much, you're talking about culture, which is connected to the land for hundreds of thousands of years. So the mobility of the population itself, except for the young people who are able to, get educated somewhere else, get a new job, move abroad, or whatever, it's completely different. And I think Mariupol, the reason that this fighting in Mariupol took place, first and foremost, it's a communication center, transportation center, where if anyone who wants to basically go by land from Crimea into the Russia proper, or Novorossiya, how they want to call that area in Russian media, has to go for Mariupol, whether it's taking a train or a road or what have you. So strategically, it's a very important place. And it's also another thing which Russian government rationale gives to the world is that denazification, which in their view is extremely important. To the degree where Azov Battalion itself was based in there, it was a base of operation there, specifically towards the eastern part of the Donbass. So that's why Mariupol became sort of a, for the lack of the better words, barely 1945 type of scenario where you have a sort of a neo-Nazis who are making the last stand in what appears to be a human shields used from a local population to defend themselves. So this creates kind of degree of a very much symbolism, both for Russia and Ukraine. Russia wants to use this as an element of the creation of the new narrative in a country where part of the Russian diaspora is being returned to the motherland. Whether this is going to take place or not after the war is over is questionable. I mean, this is going to be definitely a conversation of the political settlement of the situation. But on the Ukrainian side, it also becomes a kind of a pivotal block to build their own political myth, which right now is based on Bandera, Banderism, and neo-Nazi collaboration. So this would be a linchpin for them to recreate the founding myth into, let's say, creation of the myth against Russia, that they fulfill like a new world of independence of sorts. So each side wants to kind of play it out, this Mariupol situation, into the very important symbolism, what really represents the war itself. And I think Mariupol, that's one of the reasons that each side, beyond just the simple civilian casualties, each side is very careful to play the situation out to come out as a good guy in this fight. That's the reason Russia is not also attacking the Azov steel plant, which has X number of fighters and X number of civilians, but surrounding it just to starve it out. And that's why also Ukrainians are considering this sort of like their own last stand or last Alamo, like we call it here in the US, against the overwhelming odds. These are the heroic defenders, defending the motherland type of situation. So each side is kind of playing it, I think, more likely for political purpose as well.
I want to ask you the coining of this word neo-Nazi. Now, how justified is it? Because if you are talking of Nazis, are they comparable in the atrocities that they are doing, the people that you're talking about in Russia who are called as neo-Nazis? Is there any comparison to what we are talking about in terms of showing them as Nazis? That's one. And secondly, a certain amount of fascism exists in all countries, whether it's you have neo-Nazis in Germany and France as well, and as well as in Russia as well. There are other fascists in other countries who are quite fanatic about their religion or other communities. Now, is it justified for Russia to attack Ukraine on this ground and talk about cleansing it of neo-Nazis? I mean, in that case, can't other countries also say, I want to cleanse this country and that country from these kinds of fascists?
Well, if you look at a military conflict, justification for invasion or any kind of military action can be as a clear imminent danger, and according to the Charter 51 rule of the United Nations Charter. And neo-Nazis did not present clear and present danger to Ukraine. But that said, what makes neo-Nazis and extreme right-wing elements different than the rest of the world? They're very well armed, equipped, and trained by the West. And they were de facto kingmakers in Ukraine.
There are fascists who are armed in other countries as well.
But not with tanks and not with missiles, and these are the people who are, really well equipped. I've seen them. I've seen Azov Battalion when I went to eastern Ukraine.
But and today, can't you? I mean, then Russia should also invade Afghanistan, because Afghanistan has fascists who have tanks and a whole air force with them.
Well, I agree, and my point is that neo-Nazi clearance of neo-Nazis is not a justification for invasion. Absolutely not. However, you ask me whether neo-Nazis present were they in existence and they constitute a threat. I think they do constitute a threat, as the situation on the ground shows. Since 2014, when the so-called revolution took place and successive governments in Ukraine took over, and they finally got to the point of signing the Minsk agreement, there was simply not the two administrations of Ukraine, Poroshenko and Zelensky. They were not capable and able to put the Minsk agreement into action, specifically because of the threats and the influence of neo-Nazis in Ukraine itself. So beyond just being armed and presenting threat to whoever they don't like, they also, neo-Nazis have an incredible amount of influence in Ukrainian domestic politics, to the point of unofficially dictating the policy, what happens in the country. And this is one of the things that I think a lot of people do not understand, is that the degree of certain group having influence within society, no matter how small, is as important as the voting public that elects different parties to power. And in this way, you had basically sort of a power vacuum that was basically filled up with people who had very outlandish influence. In this case, people on the right, and who kind of dictated what happens in the country. So I think denazification is definitely a valid point, to the point of we're having a conflict and getting something good something good comes out of it. Having this type of elements being taken out, whether physically or by some kind of political denazification process, it's definitely a good thing. However, it doesn't sustain a narrative to invade another country. I mean, it's just completely different ballgame here.
Right. One question, you can quickly answer this. How do you compare Russia's behavior in terms of what they did in Chechnya and what they did in Ukraine? I mean, is it fair to say Mariupol has been as badly attacked as Grozny? I mean, is it really a right reflection, or do you think Russia has actually learned some lessons and has become a bit kinder now?
Well, I think Putin has made a reference of this special operation is not the war, meaning that they're going to go after military elements of Ukrainian military and neo-Nazi elements, but not after the population. And for all the reports which come out from the independent media, you can simply disregard all the mainstream U.S. or Western media reporting as a complete garbage fabrication, because they fit certain narrative. So I'll definitely look at more of an independent media coverage to get the real picture here. I think the matter of casualties coming from the civilian side, it's much smaller. What happened to Grozny, or what even happened when I saw myself in Mosul, Iraq, or Raqqa, for example, in Syria, where the whole parts of the cities were simply carpet bombed, and civilians were just given notice, get out or else. So this is definitely different form of modus operandi here itself. The war in Chechnya, I have not been to this area, so I have a just very vague comment on this, was definitely a war of aggression, but this happened within a internal part of the Russian Federation. So it was a sort of a domestic, very brutal short war. And also, you can also see the hypocrisy how the Western media have covered it to begin with. The first Chechen war happened under the Yeltsin government, which was supposedly friend to the West. Therefore, there was absolutely no coverage, almost no coverage of it whatsoever in the Western media itself. And some media...
Isn't it Putin who was also overseeing the atrocities and the bombing and the...
Yeah, the second war too, and this situation with the famous apartment blocks, which were blown up with killing some people in order as justification for the second war. Yes, and as I said before, whether there was definitely a war crimes, absolutely. And every war has war crimes. Not to excuse Putin and not to excuse the Russian policy towards, different areas such as, Chechnya or other places as well. But I think we have to look at it from more of a international and and complex domestic policy issues and politics in order to kind of understand exactly how those dynamics really kind of play out versus the quote unquote well-being of the population itself. And it's just really, it's kind of really hard to whether for example, Russian side is playing out the whole situation in Ukraine as sort of a necessary military operation with humanitarian characteristics. If they choose to do it that way, that's fine. But unfortunately, in every conflict, including this one, there are going to be a lot of war crimes committed on both sides. There'll be a lot of civilian, the so-called collateral damage committed as well, and there'll be a lot of people who are going to be hurt by this, regardless whether they're guilty or not. Most likely, there will be just innocent bystanders who just happen to be in the wrong place, wrong time, or sometimes they are deliberately targeted by military of both sides. So it's really kind of hard to tell exactly what whether a certain degree of humility, I would say humanity, is being applied to certain operation versus previous conflicts. This is the questions which would have to be answered after the conflict is over, when independent NGOs, the independent commissions will go to research the matter, interview the survivors, interview the victims, what have you, and then we will be able to get a much clearer picture instead of making a statement, this is good war versus bad war. In my personal opinion, I've visited several different war zones. No war is good. I think I'm pretty much of a mind where the war should really be always used as a last resort in any kind of political machinations in foreign policy or even domestic policy, because always the first victim of the every war is truth. The second is the civilian population. And this is really truly tragic what's happening in Ukraine right now. But we have to understand the mechanisms behind it and what led to it. And I think this is really important to make sure that what happened in Ukraine doesn't happen in other areas as well. And in places like in India, for example, which is extremely important because India traditionally has played an incredibly important role as a balancing agent between two different blocks, East and West, as a leader of the non-aligned movement. And unfortunately, with the bipolar world sort of migrating to the U.S. side, India has lost its significance in this balancing out capability. And I think and right now India is actually specifically being attacked by U.S. foreign policy by not siding with us or not siding with the Western interests. Well, I think it's in its own interest to sort of sit on sidelines and be sort of a moderating element to both sides, I think, which I think would be much more productive way to look at this.
Well, India still, I think, tries to maintain a neutrality because it has not severed its connection with Russia, and it has made it very clear that it would never do that in terms of trade and everything. I know there's a flag against India for that, but India sort of still stood the ground on that. I would like to ask you, where do you see it going after here? Because Russia has already gained a lot of territory in Ukraine and is likely to gain a lot more, perhaps. Where do you see the peace negotiations coming? Do you think Russia can give up those territories, or do you think it is going to end with military aggression on a long term?
Well, Russia wants Ukraine to be denazified and neutral, which by its own definition, this would require partition of the country. You have to understand that Ukraine is not a monolithic country as we see it here in the West, or a lot of people see it in the parts. It's basically two different nations which are united under one flag of one political administration. Because of the historical reference, historical memory of the Western Ukraine, what used to be part of Poland, it's completely different in the East, including its role in participation in World War II, for example. So you have different competing narratives within the one country in itself. And there's also absolutely a ethnic dimension to it as well, as Eastern part identifying themselves linguistically and politically with the so-called Ruski Mir, the Russian world. Whether the current invasion is going to change it to a certain degree, yes. But the power on the ground, which is Russian Federation, it's going to make the decisions regarding Ukraine that it's going to fit its own interest. And one of the biggest interests that Russia has right now is to establish not only peace and sort of denazification on the ground in Ukraine itself, but also a land bridge between Ukraine and Russia proper, including the republics, which means the eastern part of the Ukraine is going to be incorporated into either Novorossiya or province, or going to be not a republic, God knows what else. But this will take out huge part of the Ukrainian sea border that was based on the Sea of Azov, going up to Black Sea, and which in a way it's going to completely shorten the distance that Ukraine has as far as the coast is concerned, and with this one major port will remain Odessa. Odessa also has a large Russian-speaking population, so it's quite possible that this can also be kind of carved out to fit Russian interests. Russian interests are first and foremost predominantly concentrated or making the country a neutral place, which means that it doesn't pose a threat to them, either in the form of joining NATO.
They're annexing the whole country is slowly, as they're doing now. Do you think it is about keeping Ukraine separate as a neutral country, or is it about taking the whole country as they're doing, taking the whole territory now as they're doing?
I think some parts of Russia would be incorporated into the so-called independent republic system, but majority of the Ukrainian country would definitely become sort of like a neutral Russian influenced government, like what happened before 2014, for example. So I think that Ukraine, even after the invasion, even if it loses the war, which it does, it's going to retain some type of degree of national independence, to the degree of having its own government, its own flag. However, the question would be who would be in power, and whether the existing oligarch system that predominates in Ukraine right now is going to continue. My impression is that probably will not. And this is one of the reasons.
All the support of the West at the moment, which is now in terms of even Germany giving tanks to Ukraine, and they are going all out in terms of arming Ukraine and showing their support in terms of almost like a NATO country. With all that, do you think it would be the end of it would be a Russia-affiliated Ukraine at the end, or do you think it could go as a really independent country, which is either not in either camp, or an American influenced country?
Well, I think it's also Russia's interest to keep Ukraine to be a separate entity. First of all, economically, you're talking about a country which was very poor to begin with, and now there'll be a country which will be largely, in large part, destroyed by war, which would require incredible amount of financial resources to kind of build up to the normal level as it was before the war. And Russia definitely would not be able to take over this rebuilding process on its own. So they would definitely would definitely welcome the international participation as far as on the economic development side. So that's why I think the more reasonable, the more predictable role of Ukraine would be a country which is a buffer zone, which would be somewhat run independently from both West and East, with obviously bigger Russian influence than Western influence, since Russia is a victor on the ground here, and they're going to basically decide exactly the basis of the political game that's going to play forward. However, I do not believe that they're going to create a system where it's going to be sort of like another Soviet republic, and it's going to be part of Russia. I think the situation on the ground would simply not allow it. Specifically when it comes to sentiment of the local population, which has turned very much against Russia, specifically in the eastern part, which was Russian speaking because of the invasion itself. So you would see definitely the bigger question I think here is what's going to happen to Western Ukraine. Whether there are even voices right now in Western Ukraine to kind of make a union with Poland, for example, to Poland, goes back to its shape of its borders before 1939. And there are a lot of different kind of voices in the political sphere being thrown around right now, where if for example, independent, so-called quote-unquote independent Ukraine is being established after Russian invasion in the east, therefore the western part of Ukraine would split and establish its own political entity, whether it's republic, whether it's some kind of degree of part of another country. It's kind of hard to tell at this point. But it's hard to tell since the political and geopolitical thinking in the Western Ukraine is completely different than the rest of the country, I find it hard to believe that the Western Ukraine would become a part of the same entity which is imposed by the Russians, for example, as a result of the invasion. I find it rather, I think, impossible if you know realities on the ground. So it's most likely the country will be partitioned into a second part. That's just my personal opinion on that.
Quickly, if you might be able to answer this, what is different from Russia getting into, in 2014, getting into Ukraine and annexing Crimea so easily without almost any resistance at all, versus them trying to invade Ukraine now and trying to get any part of their territory?
Good question. I think the realities were completely different. First of all, Crimea was heavily Russian population based, but I think also you have to understand.
Mariupol, isn't it?
Yes, but the biggest player here is the economic structure as well. Crimea has been, since it became independent, used to be before it became independent, part of the Soviet Union. It was sort of a showcase of the Soviet economy, with the resorts, with a variety of different industrial infrastructure being put in place, where it was one of the most developed parts of the Soviet Union at the time. And when the independent Ukrainian government came in with the so-called Kravchuk administration, right after independence in the 1990s, they simply kind of became sort of a backwater, non-invested, some kind of falling apart. So the resentment of the population in Ukraine, in Crimea itself, against the central government was such where they simply, welcomed the invasion itself, incorporation into Russia, for a very simple, pragmatic reason. Like when I was over there, I simply, went to the street and asked regular people, exactly what they think about, being incorporated by Russia. And I was specifically told, listen, under Ukraine, I asked some old babushka, and she told me under Ukraine, I was getting $60 a month as a they couldn't even live on. But the Russians came in, my retirement became $260, which is the difference between night and day for them.
I heard this story.
Yeah. So a lot of people made a very pragmatic move actually to go with Russia, because Russia also wanted to show the Crimea to be a success story. Therefore, they put enormous amount of investment, financial investment, building infrastructure, even the famous bridge that goes from the Kachin Peninsula to Crimea itself, which they just want to show that they really care about the population itself. With obviously,
but why was there no military resistance? I mean, I can understand. It always doesn't happen according to what people want, unless there's
because in 2014, Ukrainian military has been demoralized, contrary to a lot of people think. For example, where the original myth of the creation of these eastern republics in the east was such that the Russian government got involved. They gave a lot of weapons to the local militias, local people in Donetsk and Luhansk, and they became sort of a fighting force, proxy force for the Russia fighting against the Ukrainian government. The reality is the majority of the equipment, ammunition, and military know-how that came to the so-called independent republics came from Ukrainian army units themselves that deserted, that went to the east. They simply didn't want to deal anything with as a result of the Euromaidan. They want to have nothing to do with the central government in Ukraine, specifically after the Russian language laws were passed, which was clearly discriminatory practice against the Russians living in the east. And the writing on the wall was that they're going to basically crack down on the Russian-speaking population. At least it was the perception, political perception within the population right after the 2014 Maidan. So we have a situation where.
So was it just a perception, or did it actually happen? Was it just a perception that Russian-speaking people thought they would be persecuted and they wanted to go into the Russian side, or was it what transpired afterwards?
Well, I think it was a pretty clear perception at a time, which had a chance to be fulfilled. However, as the progressive administrations have taken place, Poroshenko and Zelensky, who himself is I think, Russian speaker as well.
Yes.
This whole thing it was basically a neo-Nazi gimmick, which was once again enforced on Verkhovna Rada by the very, very strong minority. the neo-Nazi minority and the right-wing minority, and that's why we passed that law, which normally probably would, which was hollow, which to the point I don't think that there was a real threat at the time for the Russian population. It definitely at the time looked like it's going to be, because you have to understand that right after 2014 coup, situation in Kiev, it was extremely chaotic. You're talking about not only a major fighting on the streets, but also politics changing. There are mercenaries and volunteers riding around the street. I've seen mercenaries from, for example, Israel, training the military forces, the right wing, for example. They're speaking, Hebrew on a walkie-talkie. So there are people from a variety of different countries come in under a lot of different auspices, whether NGOs or whether some kind of military assistant training people. It was a complete chaos, and situation could have gone sideways anyway. So the perception of the real conflict with the eastern part of the population of Ukraine was quite real. A lot of people believed in this, and obviously this was also fed by the Russian propaganda at the time, but as I said before, the basis for this worry and the situation were quite real, and it turned out later on it wasn't, to the point where the law itself was rescinded. But on the other hand, you had this anti-terrorist operation, which basically imposed a siege warfare on the people in the east. So it further reinforced the degree of perception that the government in Kiev is after them, and they will not get in autonomy. That's one of the reasons that people, when I talk to people in Luhansk and Donetsk, they told me is that simply they still want to be part of Ukraine. They just want to have a very strong autonomy, which would be rather impossible under Ukrainian.
On the Russian side.
Yeah, well, autonomy, which means they wanted to have their own, say in how the local politics are played, how the local education system works. They definitely didn't want a Banderism and Banderas, monuments on their soil. That's for sure. And they simply wanted to kind of run their own things and just kind of play fealty to the central government in Kiev. Unfortunately, the Ukrainian governmental structure is extremely centralized, and there would have to be completed rethinking and revamping of the Ukrainian political system to accommodate for this, and this was not in the cards in any way. That's one of the reasons also that the conflict in the east started. So thinking hindsight, yes, some of the worries of the eastern population was a little bit overblown, but on the other hand, when the military policies of the so-called anti-terrorist operations came into place, with the military portion of it as well, and then this whole thing kind of fell apart. But one thing also which makes a difference between 2014 and 2004 is that 2014 and now is that the Ukrainian army has been incredibly demoralized, to the point where there's a very famous movie with the Nicolas Cage, Dogs of War, which sort of explains the situation in 1990s arms trade with Victor Bout, which happens to be in New York prison right now. Actually, I think it's like 25-year sentence. Who actually came to Ukraine after the Soviet Union fell apart, and would basically buy a lot of the Ukrainian military stock, pennies on the dollar, which then was transferred to the variety of different conflicts in Africa and other places as well. And this is one of the reasons which I think a lot of people do not understand how dangerous this conflict is after the conflict ends, is that with the West putting all the weapons in, it's simply, you're talking about a country where if the median salary is $200 per month, and one Javelin system costs $178,000, including the rocket to this system costs $78,000. If the soldier is firing, it makes 1/1000 of the in salary what the equipment is worth. What do you think is going to happen to all the weapons when the peace is actually signed? My impression is, which is extremely, I think, worrying, as much as the conflict is taking place right now, is that the weapons will be smuggled out and basically sold to the highest bidder, because since there's absolutely no accountability for it whatsoever. The West is pouring incredible amount of weapons right now, including anti-air missiles, anti-tech weapons, mines, you name it. And when there's absolutely no accountability for it whatsoever, And I'm sorry to say this, it looks like the 1990s, early 1990s scenario will replay itself again, where the weapons will be smuggled out and sold to a lot of different people, to the highest bidder, including some of the weapons being smuggled back to Western Europe, for example, maybe used in gang warfare, you name it. And this is really, it's going to be a destabilizing factor, as much as what happened in this invasion of Libya by NATO when Gaddafi was removed. All the weapons were, sold out to Central Africa. So this is really something that nobody talks about as a long-term effect of this conflict, but I think is extremely worried to be not thinking about this, because this is going to be something that's going to be a problem many, many years to come.
Yeah. At least I think it is slightly better than Libya, because Libya, it was indiscriminately given to militia and non-state actors on the ground. But here, to a large extent, it is given to the government, and perhaps they will put in some checks on how it is used. Maybe not everything, but it might be slightly better than the militia state in Libya and Syria, and how it went into the Al-Qaeda hands. I'll come to my last question, which is an important question, and I really want you to answer this. Do you see any framework for the world where it is not easy for a country to invade a smaller country so easily with just a few excuses and then creating a propaganda afterwards? Because the impact of that is, one is the destruction, but more importantly, it creates a whole host of children who are damaged for life, and who actually create a world which is a very damaged world. And the possibilities of destroying others today are huge. So I want you to answer this, because I want more people to start thinking about this, start talking about this.
Unfortunately, my answer to this would be rather negative, and I'll tell you why.
Before you started, I understand that the current framework doesn't allow it. I want you to come up with a framework which you think might be theoretical, but it might work. So say something which you think might be a possible framework to work with.
This would require complete reconstruction of the international order, which means empowering, real empowerment of international structures such as United Nations, such as International Criminal Court, to say the least, and also put a framework of laws and international mechanisms, which I think would also infringe on some of the sovereignty of different states. And I know for the fact, the reason I don't think this would work, although I think the idea you bring up is extremely noble, and I would absolutely 100% agree with you on this, is that each individual power center, and superpower itself, has its own domestic international dynamics. What most people realize is that most of the structure which makes the war, or makes the war attractive as a business proposition, economic proposition, is based on domestic policies, much more than international itself. And people who are also, let's say, on example of the United States, who are ruling our country, they come from a domestic political machine. These are not people who are internationalist degree, where they're educated abroad, speak several languages, know the reality on the ground in many different countries. No, they don't. They come from a political machine, whether it's a state political machine in the U.S. or even some degree, even a county level political machines, people who are career politicians, who understand global politics through prism of domestic, often local politics. So they do not have a much bigger framework to kind of reinforce their action for a better world, or for a better system, mechanism building system, based on something that they have to share. Because ultimately, it's about what you're proposing here is organizing community action, community society, and community action of the nations, which would basically base their actions domestically, internationally, on a simple, like a shared values platform.
Yeah, if we can have rule of law inside a country, how difficult is it to have a rule of law which is international?
Well, first of all, you have to make this discriminatory distinction here between rule of law and rule by law. They're completely two different things. And just speaking from personal experience here, living in the United States, is that we have a more of a rule by law than rule of law. Because depending who you are within the social economic strata means how the law, how law would get to you, or how you interact with law would be completely different depending on how much resources you have and who you know and so on and so forth. So this would require, once again, our political class in the West especially giving up some of its power and sovereignty to an external body. You could call the international court, you can call it some kind of degree of United Nations framework, which would make a sort of an arbitration process where certain degree of disputes and policies would be decided and implemented on independent level with input of many different stakeholders. The way world works right now, especially in the United States, where since we are waning power, we are obviously on a decline, is that the more of a social, economic, and political decline we are going to experience in our country, the more of the increase of the rapaciousness of our and aggressiveness of our political class will increase, specifically to protect themselves from their own power, protect themselves from their own power base. So it's sort of like almost, it's going to migrate to kind of dynasty politics, feudalism politics, if you want to call it that. So what you're proposing is very noble, and it's this is exactly how the original League of Nations back in 1920s was established as a result of World War I, and the idea was never again war. And that failed after a variety of different, local imperialisms, German imperialism, Italian, and Japanese imperialisms were basically kind of dissolved the institution power in the process. And the same thing happened after World War II, where we established the United Nations framework to specifically counteract it. But the major flaw in the system is such that we have a Security Council members, which are very select group of countries with a veto power, which means whoever violates certain degree of laws or even domestic policies, domestic laws in their own countries, cannot be held accountable because of the veto power. And this is a fundamental flaw in the system itself. But once again, United Nations has been brought into the existence mostly by funding of the United States and by our political setup at a time, which would first and foremost reflect our own interests first and the peace in the world second. So sometimes those two roles are very incompatible. That's why we are living in a world right now where there's a predominance of conflict, started by our country more than anyone else since 1945, which basically looks at issues in the world from self-interest first and foremost, and second of all, looks at the agenda of many different countries which want to bring something contrary to our interests as an absolute enemy to be vanquished and then kind of transferred into our own system of neoliberal values and neoliberal thinking. And this is really what a fundamental problem really is. We didn't have major adversaries in the world like China or Russia to the point where we have to worry about it economically. But right now, the rise of China has bring completely different dynamics into play itself, where we simply realizing that we simply cannot compete with it on, let's say, economic base or even military base in many different ways as well, because we simply cannot have another war come into the equation against major superpower like we have going on right now in Ukraine. So that's one of the reasons that it's really kind of hard to tell how the situation will kind of play out. But once again, this is something that, as I outlined, which would have been great to have a more of an optimistic vision for the future. This type of framework that I just specified would probably work, but realistically speaking, I don't think it's going to happen.
Yeah, I understand, but I want more people to talk about it. I want more ideas to come out so that more people can quote it, more people can discuss them.
Oh, absolutely.
This buzz goes around that we need to do it.
Yeah, and I think there's a hope for that for the younger generation, because I think you can talk about downsides and and plus sides of the internet culture, this digital economy, you name it, but it's also brings completely different new dynamics into the sphere as well, where people are much more open to the influence from different countries, and for example, netizens, people who are online, who are able to exchange ideas, they don't really see themselves as in the traditional sense as a bulwark, as an individual bold representation of their own bulwark nationalism. They're simply like human beings who want to have a good life on this planet, who are conscious of their future, conscious of a lot of different issues which previous generations were not, because they were so separated. And internet brought everybody together. The only difference is that in the different worry I have about this digital new economy, new society, is that is it going to really connect people so they do something constructive, or is going to create an environment where everybody's going to be alone together? So these are the, I think, major points which need to be kind of reinforced, I think.
Thank you very much. On that note, we will end this conversation now. There is a lot more which I wish we could talk about, but I think we are just conscious of time. Thank you very much, Derek. A lot of insightful information came out from you, and I wanted this balanced view. And you have been somebody who has, in this interview, criticized both Russia and US for the right merits. So thank you very much. Really appreciate your journalism.
Anytime. Thank you.
Thanks.
And please, if anybody wants some questions or something else, contact by Twitter.
Yeah, no, I'll put your Twitter handle in the description section below so that anybody who has more questions can contact you and can discuss things with you.
Perfect.
Great pleasure. And I would also put in the description section your articles that you wrote on Ukraine in 2015. No problem. Thanks very much for joining us today.